Hello, it is your Professor Chris Kramer. It's a beautiful day here in Santa Barbara. The sky looks lovely after a nice little rain. Rain, which of course is necessary for our plants and animals and food and all of those things. Sometimes, however, it could lead to mudslides. Hopefully that won't be the case. Nevertheless, that takes us to some interesting things to say about where we left off last time. Last time we looked at arguments for the existence of God, in particular from William Paley's watchmaker argument, or the design argument, or the teleological argument for the existence of God. The argument there was that there's a couple of versions of this, of course. The universe and everything in it is analogous to human artifacts. There's proper similarities between the two things. We know of human artifacts like computers and, of course, watches, that they were designed with a function, a purpose. A designer made them. Very little confusion about that. The universe itself is vastly more complex. The designer, therefore, would be vastly more complex than any watchmaker, of course. We also looked at Robin Collins's fine-tuning argument, which does not explicitly rely upon analogical reasoning, and so perhaps it avoids some of the concerns that we'll see in the reading for today. David Hume's dialogues dialogues concerning natural religion, and the early, in fact earlier than Paley's, example of the watch found on the ground. So you see the first slide there, David Hume's preemptive and anachronistic reply to Paley's design argument for God's existence. Here Hume is invoking Darwin. Your argument is weak, or it pales in comparison to Darwin's. It's really good stuff from Hume. And then Paley responds with, "Wow, what a great sense of humor you have." A student earlier emailed me asking about the acceptability of jokes using Hume's name, but not Kant's name. It's a legitimate concern, but there are very few jokes connected to David Hume's name, and there are too many associated with Kant, so Hume is fair game, in other words. All right, well, let's get to the argument. We see on the next slide the characters of this dialogue. Hume here is writing in dialogue form, much like we saw with, which you would have seen, I'm sure, with Plato, if you've taken Introduction to Philosophy courses, or maybe taking ancient philosophy, you know that Plato writes in dialogue form. George Berkeley, writing around the same time but before Hume, also wrote in dialogue form. A lot of benefits to this form of reading, of writing, excuse me. The characters of the dialogue, the two that we're looking at are Cleanthes and Philo. Demea is the one we don't actually, I don't think he makes an appearance in the short reading, the selection that we had. For our purposes, you can think of Cleanthes as a kind of natural philosopher, very similar to William Paley, taking on the view that people like Paley would adopt. Demea was an orthodox believer seeking out a priori absolute logical, analytic arguments for existence of God. Demea is not fond of any kind of argument that relies upon mere inductive inferences, which is primarily what you're going to find with design arguments. And then the other character who's closest probably to Hume's own philosophical view is a guy named Philo, which I suppose is not surprising, Philo being the root for philosophy. I suspect that Hume had that in mind with the name. We'll look also at we'll see Hume again when we look back we'll look into the problem of evil in the coming readings. The dialogue starts with a back and forth between Cleanthes and Philo, and Cleanthes presents what seems like a pretty obvious argument, and it's in fact basically precisely the argument we find from Paley. At least this is the historical presumption. Cleanthes says, or Hume has Cleanthes says, the curious adapting of means to ends throughout all nature resembles exactly, though it much exceeds, the productions of human contrivance, of human designs, thought, wisdom, and intelligence. Since, therefore, the effects resemble each other, and here's the key focus of any analogical argument, we are led to infer, by all the rules of analogy, that the causes also resemble. And the author of nature is somewhat similar to the mind of man, though possessed of much larger faculties, proportioned to the grandeur of the work which he has executed. By this argument, a posteriori, that is through experience, after experiencing things as opposed to a priori, and by this argument alone do we prove at once the existence of a deity and his similarity to human mind and intelligence. Philo immediately jumps on this mode of argumentation, and he offers the critique that it falls prey to what we now call the fallacy of a weak analogy. Remembering again how arguments by analogy work, what you look for are disanalogies. If I'm going to be comparing these two things, the court case examples I think were pretty straightforward. If I'm a defendant, or rather if I'm defending somebody, a client who has been charged with a crime, I say, well, look, my client's experience, my client's case is analogous to this other case, and hopefully I have even more than one case to refer to in precedent. Look at all the similarities between these two cases. They're properly and relevantly analogous, and notice how they ruled in these prior cases. Similar cases ought to be treated similarly. This is the basis of all analogical reasoning. And if we reasoned this way in the past, given the proper similarities, the relevant similarities between the two cases, we ought to reason similarly here. Now the question is, does this architect analogy, this construction analogy, which by the way you have a variation of this within scriptures early on, it's not explicit in the way that Cleanthes presents it, or Paley presents it, or even Aquinas presents it. If you recall, his fifth way is the argument by design. But in each of these cases, it seems that we are attempting to make the relevant similarities between these two situations, states of affairs, or objects. We've got the universe as such, and then we have human artifacts within it. On slide 4, the argument is presented, as we just mentioned, from similar effects we infer similar causes. Now this is the question. If this reasoning, Philo asks, is followed, if the argument by analogy succeeds, then in fact Cleanthes' position fails. And there are at least 4 in the brief section that we had for today unwanted consequences for Cleanthes or any other design arguments that attempt to prove that there is an omnipotent, omniscient, intelligent designer that follow from these analogical arguments. And the first is pretty straightforward, and it's something we've actually seen before. We've anticipated this. The first critique of the design arguments, the problems with analogy, Hume asks through Philo, how is it that we can assume anything about the designer itself, in particular, to start with? What rights do we have to go from the effects, the universe itself, what we experience in the world, to the cause, the designer, and apply any attributes whatsoever? Especially, Hume asks through Philo, how do we get infinity? How do we get eternal? How do we get a being, a designer, that is the creator of this universe, that is itself not finite? What other examples do we have to rely upon? What other universes, so to speak, have we experienced such that we can infer this universe is analogous to these other universes? And these designers are therefore going to likely be similar to this one. We obviously don't have examples like this. We've got only this one universe that we can talk about. And in fact, we saw that as a potential problem when we were discussing Collins' fine-tuning argument. Actually, the argument can go either direction, as we're going to see. But what is it that tells us anything about the designer in this, given our limited understanding, our limited perspective, our limits in scope of this, even our own galaxy for that matter? So how do we get to the designer as infinite or eternal? We have no other comparisons. To use the language of Collins from last time, what can we extrapolate from, or how can we extrapolate from what we already know about designers designing any particular kinds of things? We only have examples of finite and, by the way, imperfect designers, which takes us, of course, to the second point. And these are all interconnected. Hume has Philo sort of meld these 4 or 5 points together, kind of interwoven. How can we assume that the designer is perfect? When we speak of God, we of course are talking about a perfect being. And Hume puts it this way: and what surprise must we feel when we find him, the designer, a stupid mechanic who imitated others and copied an art which, through a long succession of ages, after multiplied trials, mistakes, corrections, deliberations, and controversies, had been gradually improving. In other words, why assume that this universe that we find ourselves in is the only go at it? Why not assume that it could be one among a multitude of attempts? This is connected, the next slide, of course. If this analogy is apt, then why not assume the possibility that the designer of this universe is, in fact, as he puts it, a bungler? This is a fantastic word that just means somebody who makes a lot of mistakes. As he puts it, many worlds might have been botched and bungled throughout an eternity before this system was itself struck out. Much labor lost, many fruitless trials made, and a slow but continued improvement carried on during infinite ages in the art of world making. Now, of course, that's assuming there's been improvement. And the images there, I think, are trying to show you bunglers. I apologize for any political inferences that you might take from that. At least the image on the right there, they seem to be bungling something where they're supposed to be holding hands, and one of them in the middle there is not getting it right. Why assume that the designer of this universe is not itself a bungler, or is alone? Related, and third point, if the analogy that we're addressing here is apt, why not conclude that there are many creators who have made many, this is connected to earlier, many successive attempts, and this one latest being the most recent. And I'm very proud of this image here, the production scene. It took me a long time to get the wording right. What's the scene? Well, it's the creation of the universe. This is, what take is this? Well, could have been an infinite number of takes where God and Steven Spielberg are putting together this film, this universe. In any case, what from our experience, how can we extrapolate to any kind of designer other than one that is analogous to the kinds of designers that we do, in fact, experience in this world? After all, if the argument by analogy is to work in this fashion, it seems, as Hume puts it, impossible not to anthropomorphize. That's a great term. In fact, he says it, why not become perfect anthropomorphites? Why not assert the deity or deities to be corporeal, that is, to be bodily, to have eyes, a nose, a mouth, and so forth? Here he's quoting from Epicurus. No man had ever seen reason but in human figure, therefore the gods must have a human figure. And this argument, which is deservedly so much ridiculed by Cicero, becomes, according to you, Cleanthes, solid and philosophical. Why not become a perfect anthropomorphized. And there you see the image of Michelangelo's God directing other gods, I suppose, to get back to building. The other god there is taking a break because he thought it was Sunday, you see. Because on Sunday, well, you get it. The argument that Cleanthes is offering, the argument that any design argument seems to be offering, that's based on analogy, is fundamentally self-defeating. If we assume certain features of the designer. And this is something that the fideist Søren Kierkegaard was concerned about. Remember, fideism is the idea that you cannot argue your way into belief, and nor should you even attempt it. Such attempts actually push God further away, as it's our reason, our intellect, our logic that defines God in a particular way. And in so defining God as all of the omnis, as eternal, infinite, we have at the same time defined God out of our lives. God is wholly transcendent. How distant and different is God from any finite, mortal, imperfect being? Well, Kierkegaard tells us there is an infinite chasm then between us and such a being. In other words, any argument by analogy here that relies upon a presumption that the designer is all perfect and all eternal and so forth, well, that argument will essentially fail, because we cannot find any comparisons between a finite being and the presumed infinite deity that is outside of space and time. We have no conception of design, of creation, that does not work with already existing things. We can talk about humans engaging in artifacts and constructing things out of and moving things around and using laws of physics, so to speak. That's all we have access to. That's all we can reason from. The analogy creates such a gap, or a leap, to borrow from Kierkegaard's language, a leap of faith that seems to be necessary rather than an argument. But there's an infinite chasm between the designed things, artifacts in this world, and the designers of things in this world, and our presumed conception of a designer that is outside of, and would have to be outside of, space and time to have been deemed a designer of everything. So the argument seems to fail. Now the question is, does such an argument that we found with Collins's fine-tuning design argument, which dealt with probabilities, that dealt with appealing to inference to the best explanation, go with the hypothesis that does not multiply entities beyond necessity, go with the hypothesis that is less surprising, and so on. The probabilistic argument, the fine-tuning argument that Collins offers, presumably avoids a lot of the problems that are found with analogical arguments that move from mundane, even profane, limited, finite, flawed designers in this world to an infinite, perfect, infinitely distant, and therefore wholly disanalogous to any conception of a designer in this world. We can avoid those problems by saying the design argument does not rely upon analogical reasoning, but merely upon an inference to the best explanation. One argument, and there's a lot of them, I'm not going to be able to go through all of them in detail. I've labeled them additional Humean problems with design arguments, and these are extrapolations from Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. Some of them are taking quite a bit of liberty in connecting to Hume, because Hume primarily focuses on analogical problems with analogical arguments, and so we'll look and see if they can be applied to fine-tuning type arguments. And one of them had to do with, if you recall, a discussion of laws of nature. And we discussed that with Collins's fine-tuning argument, whence these laws of nature themselves. and we looked at some of the problems with Hawking and Laudnow's text and their scientific presumptions that the universe is explicable because we can model laws of physics, laws of nature. That is a fascinating thing to understand, as Einstein himself put it. But it just pushes the question back. Where did these laws of physics come from? If they seem to be elemental in explaining the fact of existence at all, and specifically the fact of the kind of existent beings that do exist, namely conscious beings that can consider their own existence. One critique might be that design arguments that call out for a designer based upon these laws is that it is equivocating, and Hume's kind of implying this in the background of the design argument critique as well, but it's equivocating on this concept of law. And so I have a variation of this argument, premise 1, this is slide 11, all laws require lawmakers. That sounds obvious, straightforward. There's a law against driving barefoot, I think, in California. That's a law. That didn't just happen. It didn't just come to us. Somebody made it. Premise 2, there are laws of nature. Premise 3, these are discovered, not made, by humans. Premise 4, the law of nature maker must be enormously powerful. Premise 5, or claim 5, or conclusion, therefore what? I leave that open. For those of you who took logic, critical thinking, you remember that the fallacy of equivocation is a error in semantic, or due to semantic ambiguity. A concept, or a term rather, is ambiguous if it has more than one meaning. And if in an argument I use one term that has multiple meanings, but I do not in the context clarify which meaning I'm using, then it makes it seem like a conclusion follows very clearly and deductively and absolutely. This conclusion seems to follow that there must be a maker of the laws of nature, because all laws require lawmakers. Well, that begs the question, as well as engaged in a fallacy of equivocation, because we are, what they would say in logic, equivocating on the word law. Just as we may be equivocating on the word design. We'll see this with evolutionary accounts as well. It is not necessarily the case that laws of nature must have lawmakers, whereas it is the case that any man-made or human-made laws, by their very definition, are created, are designed, are written by people. So all legal laws, if you want, or all moral laws perhaps even, something we'll return to at the end of the semester, require lawmakers. But there's different senses. The laws of our court system are quite different than the laws of logic, are quite different than the laws of physics. And to fail to make that, to see that distinction, I think it can lead to problems in reasoning. There's another, just to give you another clarification of equivocation. What is the argument? Only man is rational. Premise 1. Premise 2, no woman is a man. Conclusion, women are not rational. That is a terrible argument for various reasons, but most in particular here, it equivocates on the concept or term man, because it has two distinct meanings, and we've used both of those meanings in the same argument without clarification. Man as referring to gender, or man as referring to the collective humankind, for example. And as I mentioned, it could be that we have alternative explanations for the multiplicity of life. And here it is again with Darwin ruining everything. His theory of evolution as a competing natural explanation. And if you recall, there was a discussion about Occam's razor in our previous discussion of Collins's argument. the principle of parsimony, the simpler hypothesis is to be preferred. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. This was used by Collins to justify, in his prime principle of confirmation, that the hypothesis that there is a designer is less surprising and, in fact, more plausible due to being simpler than assuming there is no designer, or an atheistic no-design universe. Now the question is, where does this principle apply, all things being equal, with respect to the competing hypotheses? Evolution works. Evolution is sound science. If evolution were flawed in any fundamental way, we would have to say that most of our other sciences that depend upon it, and we discussed this before, think about other areas in biology, other areas in geology, other areas in chemistry. Think about how we try to study viruses, for example. We try to we see how these viruses evolve. And this becomes, all of this gets thrown out if theory of evolution is flawed. It would be incredibly devastating, and it would be absurd to an extent to say that the theory of evolution is fundamentally wrong, because then so too would most of our other biological sciences that depend upon that. That's a variation of a reductio ad absurdum. But that's not really the question here. And I think those who advocate for evolution in contrast to design may be talking past one another, the design theorists, the design theists, and evolutionary theorists, because one is questioning where life came from, and the other is answering, it evolves. Those are different questions. Does the fact of evolution, I'm going to just, given what I've said, I hope that suffices, that it is, let's take for the sake of argument that evolution is sound science. Can we explain the theory of evolution in terms of a designer, or does it make more sense to explain it in terms of an undesigned, if you want, accidental universe, in the way that Richard Dawkins, for instance, does in his book, The Blind Watchmaker? Where does Occam's razor apply? So if you recall, evolution helps explain how life evolves, but it's not obvious that it helps us explain where life came from to begin with. And here, in fact, Richard Swinburne, in his book, The Existence of God, he uses the principle of parsimony, simpler hypothesis is to be preferred, Occam's razor, to justify the design hypothesis. He says, quote, "It would be the height of irrationality to postulate innumerable universes just to explain the particular features of our universe, when we can do so by postulating just one additional entity, namely God. Science requires us to postulate the simplest explanation of the data, and one entity is simpler than a trillion," end quote. If you recall, Swinburne here is referring to the multiverse hypothesis, or the multiple universe hypothesis. The idea that the universe is a brute fact and has always been, or in the language of Anselm and Aquinas with respect to the need to explain the contingency in the universe, there has to have been a necessary being that has always been, that is the cause of all of this contingency that we experience. The atheistic argument is the single universe is all that there is, and it came about accidentally, out of nothing, or a multiverse hypothesis, or some variation of these two, and the physical stuff, all that there is, has always been in one form or another. Think about the Big Bang, Big Crunch, and so on. And these other universes that we do not have access to, we do not perceive them because we cannot, are hypothesized. They are, as Swinburne would put it, speculation. And in order to explain the probabilities of there being life as not being so improbable, because if you've got a multiverse, you've increased the probabilities of there being life. It's no longer so improbable. Swinburne's response is, as was Collins's last time, this violates Occam's razor. We are multiplying entities, in this case universes, well beyond necessity. And isn't it a simpler hypothesis to invoke just one entity over a trillion? And that sounds obvious on the face of it. But consider this, and this is an actual quote, I think it was from the show Ghost Hunters, and this was a putative skeptic. Not skeptic, he didn't call himself a skeptic. He called himself, I can't remember how he framed it, but he wanted to distance himself from people who believed in ghosts being ubiquitous, ghosts being all over the place, there being many, many, many ghosts. He thought that hypothesis was absurd. But he was fine with accepting the view that there was or is at least one ghost that he himself experienced. As he put it, I don't think there are a lot of ghosts running around everywhere. I only believe in the one ghost that I saw. Now, end quote. The assumption there is he thinks he's using Occam's razor, or it sounds like a principle similar to Occam's razor. It's less absurd to invoke the existence of one ghost over millions of them. Right? That does not follow. The moment I've introduced ghosts, regardless of the number of them, in fact, if I only introduce one ghost, that would be strange. Why would there only be one of this category? The moment I introduce this fundamentally new, and in this case, inexplicable entity into our realm, our ontology, as it's sometimes called. Ontology is the study of being, of existence. When we invoke ghosts, even just one, we have already violated Occam's razor. We have already introduced extra stuff that is itself inexplicable. In other words, I might say, I hear a noise up in my attic, and so there are three hypotheses. One is that it was a squirrel. The second hypothesis, it was a family of squirrels. The third hypothesis, it's 1,000 squirrels. I don't know why that's funny. Among those competing hypotheses, the first two, that it is one squirrel or that it is a family of four, right? The perfect family. One female and one male child, of course. Those are basically equally sound hypotheses. Depends upon the amount of noise that you're hearing. But introducing thousands of squirrels in your attic as a hypothesis for the noises you're hearing, well, that's less likely the case. You've introduced more entities than necessary. However, that 1,000 squirrel hypothesis is still superior, using Occam's razor, to invoking one singular ghost. One ghost. That already violates Occam's razor, because now, instead of offering an explanation for the mystery, the noise in the attic, we've increased the mysteries. We've increased the things that now need to be explained. What in the world is a ghost? How do ghosts make noises? Can you register their activity? Are they physical in some way? If they're not physical, how is it that we can seemingly register them in our Geiger counters? I'm assuming that that's what's happening when on Ghost Hunters they can somehow measure the temperature changes or the motion of these non-physical objects. It seems somewhat contradictory. In any case, the analogy here, and it's merely an analogy, ghosts and God, if you see, invoking God is a fundamentally different kind of designer, than another physical universe. Even if we invoke multiple physical universes, those are still the same kinds of stuff, which is very different than introducing a fundamentally new kind of entity. In any case, on we go. Back to this discussion of Darwin and this conception of apparent design. And I don't want to focus on this because we already covered this the very first day when we looked, or second day, when we looked at Paul Bloom's contemporary scientific account trying to explain religion. why is it that we see design everywhere? And there's a wonderful video, which I'm not going to play now, but it's Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron. And Ray Comfort is explaining the perfect fruit, which, as you all know, is the banana, because it is clearly perfectly designed for human consumption. It has its own sheath that is biodegradable, non-slip. You can peel it. It's perforated perfectly. It's designed perfectly for the size of your mouth, which he demonstrates to much amusement, I suppose. It's just obviously perfect and designed for human consumption. The image, or rather this video, is a bit aggressive at attacking this view, because there is an alternative scientific hypothesis for the evolution of bananas. And of course you can look at counterexamples, as we'll see next time when we look at the problem of evil. While the banana seems perfectly designed for human consumption, there's a lot of other things in the world that do not appear to be designed. In fact, they appear to be designed to our and for our detriment, as we'll see. Now, why do we see this design? Well, it could be merely apparent. And I'll remind you, and I have a number of the slides linked here, our discussion and review from Paul Bloom, where he was talking about the possibility of God and religion as such being an accident. It could be that design or intentionality is merely apparent and not actual. And we saw that with the experiment of the apparent behavior of triangles and circles. These are geometrical shapes that are moving in such a way that appears to have design or purpose or function. And there are some interesting computer models that develop and that move these objects in such a way that give it apparent design. They're not programmed to make it. They're set up such that anyone watching it, it seems obvious that we can impart to these objects, to these things, that they have design. And you see this with pattern recognition as well. We looked at that with pareidolia, where you see certain patterns and we jump to conclusions that those patterns are really there in the universe, in the world, but we are, as some philosophers put it, teleologically, what's the term? We are, I've forgotten the phrase, promiscuous, that's a weird word, but I think we're promiscuous teleologists. It's a good name for a band. We are primed to see patterns. We are primed to see intentionality, maybe for our survival, evolutionarily speaking, but that is very different than saying there's actual patterns in the world. Refer to those slides, pareidolia with respect to hearing things as well, hearing backwards, backmasking as it's called. When you're primed to see these patterns, you actually do, even when they aren't really there. We sort of, they're a kind of confirmation bias. In addition, we might look at the critique about laws of nature that we saw before. It may be that we do not now have much success in explaining how life came about. We don't have an answer, and I think that's a legitimate response for scientists. If they don't know something, if they're decent scientists, they will say, we don't know. We don't understand how it is that life came about. And we don't understand how there's only life on this planet, as far as we know. It could be that there's life on other planets, but from what we can experience with our own solar system, there does not appear to be the conditions necessary for life. And so our understanding of the laws of nature, the life-permitting laws, this is a version of a critique against design arguments called the exotic nature of life response, where there may in fact be parameters, the criteria or conditions for life may be such that it's not as improbable as we might think, and it may be due simply to our ignorance, as so much of the history of science is. We realize that we've made mistakes in the past. 200 years ago we couldn't, or 500 years ago we might not have even thought of the fact of germ theory as the cause of sickness. Instead, we would assume something like the individual had it coming. It has a moral failing that leads to sickness. We find a lot of the previous explanations, the non-scientific explanations, fall by the wayside when science comes along and finds hypotheses that are superior, and we can talk about why that is. In fact, we will look at that more with argument from evil, to explain where we've made mistakes in the past. And admitting that we don't even understand much of what keeps certain creatures alive, on this planet, much less any other planet. And there's a nice little video to kind of discuss that. When you look at the depths of the ocean, we're finding that there are some really curious creatures that seem to thrive in conditions that would hitherto have been thought impossible for anything to survive. The amount of pressure miles down underwater seems to preclude the possibility of life. However, we find even on this planet there are the possibilities of life. There's actual life in ways we could not or would not have expected. And connected to this, slide 22 here, what actually are the probabilities of life on just this planet or anywhere in the universe? In other words, how improbable is it that there is conscious life? There's a mathematician who writes on the webpage, Aeon, I think that's how you say that, and there's a link there, why improbable stuff happens all the time. And this is a critique of a version of the fine-tuning argument that says the best explanation for there being this apparent design is that there's an actual designer, because again, the hypothesis on the alternative view is so improbable, and that which is improbable is, of course, unlikely to be the case. There's an example, though, and the mathematician shows this, that in fact improbable things happen, extremely improbable things happen all the time. What would be very strange if there weren't any improbable things. There's an example of this given from a philosopher, it's Pfizer, it's his last name, I can't think of the first name, but it's something like this. Consider you find a stone or a rock in your yard, which is a seemingly trivial thing. What was the example he gives? You find this rock, you think about all of the contingencies that led to that stone being the shape that it is and the position that it is at the time that it is in your backyard. So he says something like, suppose I walk in my yard and I pick up a stone. I consider all the conditions that had to take place for it to be located in my yard precisely where it is. If any one of, a million factors, or you can probably even more than that, if you think about what goes into something being where it is at any particular time, had been different by a minuscule, infinitesimally small way, whether it has to do with going back to glaciers moving in a particular way, the particular temperature in any given year, how much rainfall there was, what's the soil composition, animal activity, and so on. There's a potentially infinite number of possible connections here. Then that particular stone would not be exactly as it is. So it would be very weird then to say the only explanation, or the best explanation, is that stone was put here by a designer. It was fine-tuned to be just as it is. Now that doesn't seem to follow, and by analogy, if that doesn't follow, then we might say something similar with respect to versions of the fine-tuning argument. Now, in addition to that, and somewhat perhaps conversely to that, we'll see, why isn't there much more life everywhere else? Is this universe well designed? And here's an image from the Hubble telescope looking at all of the multiple galaxies. Those are galaxies. And there are potentially billions of them. And in our own solar system, we talked about this before, it does not at all appear that it is hospitable to life, except on Earth. And as we'll get to next time, it's not obvious that Earth is set up just right. If you think about the Goldilocks principle that we talked about last time, the anthropic principle, the idea that this cosmos was created for us. If it were created for us, why does it seem that we're the only speck in the universe that has life? And this is a fascinating field. If you recall, SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, that was started back, I believe, by Carl Sagan. The idea is looking for the possibility of there being life in other galaxies, other planets. And by the way, the limited distance that we can see, it does appear that there are a number of planets that are equidistant to their sun, as is Earth. And it may be the case that if the conditions are such that there's life on these other planets that are so distant from us that, of course, we can't do anything but hypothesize about it. However, if you look at the somewhat mocking tone of the next slide, the universe is not fine-tuned for life. As it says, the volume of the observable universe, that's a key point, something that Hume brought up, is, and it's a huge number there, I can't even list, the volume where life can exist on Earth, like seas, Earth, the seas, surface, the atmosphere, is an infinitesimally tiny number. So the percentage of the universe where life can exist is incredibly tiny. And then the question is, do you call that fine-tuned? The universe is beautiful, and then it says, but it will kill you at the first opportunity, which I think is actually what Schopenhauer said well before this. The universe is beautiful to behold, but horrible to be a part of. And maybe that leads to the idea that, life and the universe is just an accident, which, of course, you find the somewhat contradictory cartoon where God is saying, this is a little embarrassing to admit, but everything that happens for no real reason. I think that's amusing. If true, of course, it's perhaps not pleasant to us. To expand on this question of probabilities, what appears to be happening with design arguments is that we go from our own existence to the probability, the likelihood of God's existence. And this example comes from Stephen Law. I have another example from him later on, but he says, consider this reasoning here. The first claim says, given God's existence, assume that God exists, the existence of humans would be probable. Everything we know about the presumption of God, if God exists, well then it's probable that humans would exist. But that claim does not entail, doesn't lead to, given the existence of humans, God's existence is probable. Now that's a version of the design hypothesis. To make sense of that, to make that more clear, on the next slide we see a comparison. Premise 1, claim 1, given the existence of a royal flush in cards and poker, a winning hand is probable. I don't know much about poker. I don't know if a royal flush is... I guess you can have two royal flushes, I think somebody once told me. I don't know what the hell that means. It's when the queen goes to the bathroom and then... Alright, never mind. Given the existence of a royal flush, a winning hand is probable. Fine. But that does not entail that, too, given the fact that you won in the card game, that you must have had a royal flush. In other words, the analogy here that Stephen Law is trying to push is you winning, you existing, does not lead to you having a royal flush, that God exists. And that ties in with our discussion of the mathematician's conception of probabilities. Consider another argument related to this, additional Humean problems. Hume actually puts it this way through Philo. I don't think in the selection that you had, however. We are inferring from our experience design in this universe. But we have access to a minute fraction of this universe and are making an inference about its designer. And this analogy is not Hume's, obviously, but consider watching a 3-hour movie for a millisecond. You turn it on, you show a millisecond of that movie. And from that millisecond, you can infer, or you claim, to know who made the movie and why they made it, and that, and this is key, the movie was good. As Hume himself puts it, how can we make any positive assertions about a designer of this vast universe that we have seen 0% of? That's a paraphrase, of course. And related to that, how good actually is this creation? Using the term creation, of course, begs the question, but we're, for the sake of argument, assuming, yes, fine, there must be a designer. If that argument succeeds, even if it succeeds, and we get convinced, we are convinced by Paley's analogical argument or Collins's fine-tuning argument, okay, fine, there's a designer, what, Hume asks, can this design, can these effects actually tell us about the designer itself? I give an analogy with this watch here. We ask, who made this clock or this watch? On the left you find a watchmaker. I guess that looks like a watchmaker. On the right you've got, I think that's Garfield. And of course he's smashing his alarm clock. How could we know? What is it about the clock that we're looking at there that tells us anything about its designer? Actually, you can see something here. The clock has no hands, I don't think. That's interesting. So that tells us something. Either the designer is flawed because they didn't make it with hands, or is flawed because the hands broke off. In either case, that tells us perhaps a little something about the designer. It doesn't tell if it's male or female. It doesn't tell us if it's old or young. It doesn't even tell us if it's a. It certainly doesn't tell us if it's a good person, a good designer, good in the sense of morally good. We don't know any of that, and we can't, based upon our limited perspective, as Hume says. And if you look at again at the Hubble telescope image of the universes, who made this? Could it be God? That is all good, or this scary fellow here, that's the scariest picture of the devil I could find. How can we know anything about the putative designer of this universe, assuming we're convinced that there must be a designer, or that there is a designer due to the probabilistic arguments we've already addressed? This takes us into problems that we've been anticipating for some time. And I mentioned Stephen Law moments ago. He turns this design argument on its head, and he imagines, suppose there's a single creator God, and that God is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, and omni-malevolent. That is, this God, if it exists, is cruel beyond our comprehension. His malice knows no bounds. Law says it's not reasonable for us to believe in this God, and we'll see why that is later. But his conclusion is, it is no more or less reasonable to believe in an omni-malevolent God, an all-evil God, as it is to believe in an all-good God. The evidence for one is no better or worse than the evidence for the other. How is it that we can know? What can we tell about the moral features of such a designer? This is the variation of the problem of evil. It's just turned on its head, and he calls it the problem of good. Imagine we believe in an all-evil being. Well, if there's an all-evil being that created everything, how could you explain all the good in the world? Do you see how it's a reversal? How could you explain the beauty, the grandeur, kittens, and other things that are great? That seems to be only explicable in terms of there being an all-good God. And there are interesting responses to this. No, that's exactly what you would expect an all-evil God to create. Of course there's going to be kittens, but kittens die eventually. And they have horrible lives, ultimately. And humans eventually get old, and once they get to the point of having wisdom, say in their 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever, once they start to achieve that wisdom that took lifetime to accumulate, their brains start to deteriorate and wither, and so there we see, aha, that's just as an all-malevolent being would have made it. And in fact, John Stuart Mill offers some interesting commentary that seems to push this very view when he puts it in Humean fashion, if you will. He says, if a tenth part of the pains which have been expended in finding benevolent adaptations in all nature had been employed in collecting evidence to blacken the character of the Creator, what scope for comment would not have been found in the entire existence of the lower animals, divided, with scarcely an exception, into devourers and devoured, and a prey to 1,000 ills from which they are denied the faculties necessary for protecting themselves. I'll talk more about that with the life of squirrels, at least from my perspective. Squirrels have just shitty lives. If we're not obliged to believe the animal creation to be the work of a demon, it is because we need not suppose it to have been made by a being of infinite power. But if imitation of the Creator's will, as revealed in nature, were applied as a rule of action in this case, the most atrocious enormities of the worst men would be more than justified by the apparent intention of Providence, that throughout all animated nature the strong should prey upon the weak. What this takes us to, as you might already have imagined, is the problem of evil. Or, as I like to call it, who created the platypus and why? Or, what the hell is the platypus? And surely no intelligent designer made that on purpose. And I have an image of a platypus. If you don't know what it is, surely you do. It's a mix between a duck, a beaver, a cow, a fish. I don't really know what it is. And maybe this is evidence of design, because it's just incredible. I believe it lactates, it spits out poison, it's lays eggs, I think. There's so many features to it that's just fascinating. Anyway, it just seems like a kind of conglomeration of parts that were left over from other species that, if there's a designer, threw them all together. We'll talk again about the evolutionary aspects of this. Another version of this, another name for the problem of evil that we'll get into next time, comes from my daughter Lola, where she said, not but 3 days ago now, why are even bugs a thing? It's just a fantastic question. Why are even bugs a thing? We'll talk about that. And in particular, bugs like the screw fly, which was not something that she was talking about specifically. But if you want to know what a screw fly is, well, of course, you should come back next time. But it is not going to be pleasant. Next time we'll look at Rowe's argument. William Rowe, very famous philosopher of religion, just recently passed away, I think. We'll talk about his what he'll call evidential argument, and this will be further. Actually, it's sort of extending our discussion from Hume and his dialogues in natural religion as critique of varieties of the design argument. So next time, on to the problem of evil, and you could imagine that contemporary events in the world might be relevant to our discussion of that. Until then, wash your hands and stay healthy and safe. Talk to you next time.